Hey, welcome to episode 5 of the Bible Bistro. We're continuing this series of our introduction to the book of Lamentations, which I'll be preaching on later this summer, coming up relatively soon. This is part 5 of what will be a 6-part series, and we're looking at today Lamentations and the topic of suffering. Lamentations and suffering. What does it tell us about suffering? What does it contribute to the church's vocabulary about this? And one of the big questions that come up is, why is this book in the Bible at all? It is often neglected, as I've mentioned, rarely preached on, rarely engaged with. And in Chris Wright's commentary, which I've been using, and by the way, all this today is from Wright's commentary on Lamentations, he recalls a conversation he had with a woman, a friend of his, and she said this: Lamentations, I don't think I've ever really read it, said a friend, though she had half a century of personal Christian faith. On hearing about my work on this commentary, I sometimes wonder why it's in the Bible at all, she said. And that's a good question. Why is it in the Bible? What does it contribute? What does it give us as a church, as a Christian community? What's its contribution to us? Why is it here? And particularly, it's here because suffering is real. And suffering is part of the human experience. Suffering is part of the Christian message. And so what does Lamentations contribute to that? Why is it here? Why should we listen to it? What do we have here? What does it give us in how we engage and understand suffering? So the first thing it provides for us, why it's in the Bible, is it provides us a memorial. A memorial. And I've talked a little bit about this in other episodes of this, lest we forget. Right? One of the things we do as a culture, as a people, is that we want to remember things, particularly painful things, particularly times of suffering and travail. And the way we often do that is by erecting monuments or memorials to that. I mentioned earlier the Vietnam Memorial. There's many war memorials. There's memorials to 9/11. There's memorials to Pearl Harbor. Right? There are these moments where we want to erect something that is engages our memory. And of course, think about the Holocaust, right? The risk of not remembering, of forgetting suffering, and then being doomed to repeat the same mistakes that we made before, or to engage it. We don't want to deny suffering. And so one of the ways we do deal with that is by having a memorial to that event, lest we forget. And even right now, over this summer, right, when in the killing of George Floyd, one of the icons, right, was this mural, this painting that was there. We need things that memorialize suffering, and that's something that happened with that as a kind of an icon of suffering. And even when the suffering's over, we don't want to forget it. We don't want to deny it. We need to engage with it. And this book is a memorial. It's a memorial to those people who suffered greatly in the Babylonian captivity and deportation, who saw the destruction of their homeland, their temple, their city, and this is their recorded memorial. And so one of the things Lamentations does for us is help us to not forget, to not engage in denial. This comes from Kathleen O'Connor, who I've mentioned numerous times, her great little book, Lamentations and the Tears of the World, which I'll be quoting from frequently, and Wright does as well, that she wrote, "The biblical book of Lamentation refuses denial, practices truth-telling, and reverses amnesia." That's one of the reasons why we need to engage this book, because it is a memorial to suffering of real people that we can learn from. The second reason is a voice. And what we're dealing with there is a memorial is effective. Having these type of things built out of stone or whatever, this kind of tangible thing to look at, to visually engage with. But you need something else, I think, to really grasp suffering. And so you need a voice as well as a monument or a memorial. And the voice comes through poetry. And if you think about it, think of all the songs that are evocative, even of the Vietnam era or protests, or in the civil rights movement. The letters from the Birmingham jail. Things you need a voice. The speeches of Martin Luther King. There's something about poetry, Maya Angelou, whatever. I mean, we need a poet laureate, right? We need to have a voice of poetry. And so what Lamentations gives us, in addition to being a memorial, it gives us that memorial in a voice of a poet. And Wright talks about, World War I, there are monuments to World War I, but you really find the heart and soul of the suffering, the voice of the suffering, and the poetry that came out of World War I. So, in many ways, even Tolkien's Lord of the Rings, right, is kind of a story and a poetic kind of reflection in a bit on his World War I experiences. So you got that type of thing too, a voice here, and we're forced to listen to that voice. It's memorialized for us. It's there. It's a voice we need to listen to. And we become witnesses to it then, right? We hear that voice. And so here we are, millennia later, hearing that voice, joining in the witnesses to the suffering of people. And we do that anytime we engage, particularly with poetic things from the past. Poetry has a powerful role in speaking a voice for those who suffer. All right, thirdly, a confession. A confession. What we have in the book of Lamentations is something very necessary because it engages in reflection on how humans bring upon themselves suffering through their sinful rebellion and folly against God and God's ways and God's laws. And so Lamentations it's sobering. It reminds us, we're living in a time where people want to render God toothless, right? A toothless lion, that, people don't want to talk about wrath, judgment, sin, human failures. They're real, and this book makes us, look at this in a sober way. The impact of sin. Now, this has to be balanced, okay? There's a danger in connecting in some type of simple equation sin and suffering, because we know from the book of Job, suffering can occur for a lot of reasons entirely unrelated to personal sin, right? Jesus talks about this with the man born blind. Did he sin or did his parents sin? Well, neither, and this is the truth we always need to keep in tension. But the reality of suffering being a product of human sinfulness, even if it's if it's indirectly so, right? That we create in many ways our own suffering. Look at the issues right now we're dealing with in our culture in trying to address racial reconciliation, things like that. We're having to come to terms with the impact of sin. Is that an individual sin? Well, yes, it is in a way, right? Is it a national sin? Yes, it is in a way. Is it a product of the fall of sin in general? Yes, it is. And that's kind of a thing, right? We need to wrestle with. And this book does that. These people suffered as a direct consequence of their sinful behavior, their violation of God's covenant. God said to them, I'm going to make a covenant with you. You will have this land, but here's how I want you to live in response to me. This is how I'm calling you to live, to be. And if you fail to keep this, if you fail to live this way, I will vomit you out of the land, right? You will lose this possession that you have. And that's exactly what happened. If you look at the Babylonian captivity, it is the enacting of the covenant sanctions against Israel, that they lost the land. And this is what the writer, the poet of Lamentations fully admits to and recognizes. It is a time of national confession that's recorded here in this book, and that's important for us to hear. Listen to a couple of samples. Chapter 1, verse 8. Jerusalem sinned grievously, right? There's no denial on the part of the poet. The poet recognizes the role of the people. Jerusalem sinned grievously, so she has become a mockery. All who honored her despise her, for they have seen her nakedness. She herself groans and turns her face away. Jerusalem sinned grievously. A confession of sin. How about verse 14? My transgressions were bound into a yoke by his hand. They were fastened together. They weigh on my neck, sapping my strength. The Lord handed me over to those whom I cannot withstand. My transgressions were bound into a yoke. Sin transgression. This book is a confession of sin. Now, we have to be careful here to balance that correctly, but we need to recognize the reality of it. And this is what Wright writes about this on page 38 of his commentary. He talks about, he says, but the other inadequate response to the confession of sin in Lamentations is at the opposite extreme, to claim it completely explains everything. Okay, so here's the balance. So we can read the horrific accounts of all the violence, destruction, and suffering and simply say it was all God's punishment for their sin. And then we can close the book with grim satisfaction that the moral balance of the universe is intact. They got what they deserved. But that surely is to fail to listen to the agonized voices in the book when they surround their honest acknowledgement of their own sin with honest questioning of what today would be called the proportionality of the suffering inflicted on them by Babylon in the day of God's anger. What's he saying there? He's saying here, while we can acknowledge this is a confession of sin, while we can acknowledge that the people's sin contributed to this, whether it's personally related, whether it's nationally related, whether it's indirectly related as a sin from the fall, there's also, it does not leave us with a simplistic answer that they got what they deserve. There's a wrestling in this book, right? With the proportionality of it, with the God who brought that judgment, and the people are there. They're wrestling with two things. They recognize their sin, but they're also questioning, Lord, why this level of punishment? Is this fair? Is this proportional? Did we deserve this for what we did? We acknowledge we were wrong, but why so draconian of a punishment? So that's the important counterbalance. To remember, those two things have to be held in tension, that there is a true sinful contribution of Israel to this, but there's also this wrestling. And that gets us to our next point. What this book gives us, why it's here, is it provides us with a protest. A protest. And what do I mean by that? It's a protest here against God. And this goes to the other balancing of the confession part. The people are saying, but God, how can you let this much happen to us? How can you let this happen to your people? And there's a certain pushback against God. There's an acknowledgement that God is sovereign, that he brought this on the people. The people sinned and contributed to it. But here's the protest of saying, this is too much. Lord, where are you? Why are you letting this happen? How can you let this happen to your people? Your name's being sullied because people are looking at the people of your name. And so there's this protest of the people against God. This is from Wright's commentary. It says, it is faith struggling with vertigo over the chasm between what it knows to be true about God and the realities of what it sees or experiences in this fallen world, right? So the people are trying to hold in tension. God is good. God is sovereign. We sinned. We're being punished. But it seems out of whack. And Lord, how can you let this happen? And so this goes to how Lamentations helps the church in regard to suffering, and how we relate to it, how we give voice to it, how we speak back to God about it. When we can say, and before God, we acknowledge that we have sinned, but this seems too great. Why, Lord? How long will this go on? How long, O Lord? And so that's something this book gives us. It gives us that balance with the protest along with the confession of sin. Why is this happening? Now, finally, a home and a bottle. What does that mean? Well, the other part of this is that this book provides real ministry to people who are suffering. So if you are going through suffering right now in your life, this is a book that you can go to and you can find comfort in, or at least resonance with, and it can help you get through those times by connecting yourself to the voice of these people who suffered, by recognizing that this is part of the walk of a believer, by being able to see that it is not unfaithful to protest and to confess, right? To do both of those things at the same time, to mourn and lament. All of this comes through. So again, this is mostly from Kathleen O'Connor, these two ideas. She does a great job in her book about this. And so what's the home in the bottle? What's the idea? Well, let me read this to you. This is from Wright's commentary, but he's drawing from Kathleen O'Connor. He writes, for that reason, the book provides, that is the Lamentations, in Kathleen O'Connor's very apt phrase, this is her phrase, quote, a house for sorrow and a school for compassion. That's what O'Connor says, that this book, Lamentations, provides a house for sorrow and a school for compassion. He goes on, this is now Wright speaking. Lamentations is a home for the sufferer. It provides the safe space, the rooms in which grief can be expressed to its limits over and over again without interruption or denial, even if without comfort as yet. Or to change the metaphor, using the title of her book, Kathleen O'Connor's book, Lamentations and the Tears of the World, we might think of Lamentations for the tears of the world. So what he is saying, what Kathleen O'Connor is saying, is that this book is a home. It provides a safe space for people who are suffering. You can find yourself here. You can be here and feel safe and have that expression of what's going on in your life, and it gives you the voice for it. It helps you to kind of orient yourself in a real way as a believer. So it is a home for the sufferer. This is why the church needs this, and it also lends for a national voice, a national home for national suffering, because that's wrapped up in this, right? It's not just the individual, it's the entire nation. And we could argue the church, right? This is the church of the Old Covenant suffering in a great way. This gives the church a voice as well, a home to go to. Also, a bottle. What's that have to do with? Well, that's the tears imagery. Tears imagery. This is what Kathleen O'Connor says. Remember her book, Lamentations and the Tears of the World. This is what she writes about this. The tears of Lamentations are of loss and grief, abandonment and outrage. They are a flag, a sign, a revelation of injury and destruction, an expression of resistance to the world's arrangements. Lamentations validates tears. It has the power to gather bitter pain and bring tears to the surface, then it accepts them. She goes on, God receives and tenderly holds tears as if they are precious, explosive testimony that must be preserved for some future day. Perhaps this vigilant, seeing, tear-collecting God weeps with the weeping world. Lamentations does not say this, of course. Remember, God's voice is missing here. But the book itself is a sacred bottle for the tears of the world. It records them in a book, respects them, keeps account of them to present to God when God is ready to receive them. So here in this book, if you want to think about the book of Lamentations, it is a bottle of the tears of the world, right? Here it is. God has collected this. He has preserved it through His Holy Spirit. It comes down to us today. And if you think about the book as a bottle, what a great metaphor. Here are the collections of the tears of these people. And that reminds us that God cares and that He hears and that He is not abandoned His people. He remembers the tears of His people. He collects them in a bottle here, a home and a bottle. And the way we know God hears, and the way we know His voice does break into human history regarding suffering, is because He sent His Son, Jesus Christ. And that's what our last episode will be about. It'll be about the book of Lamentations and Jesus Christ. So why does this book exist? Why is the book of Lamentations here? What does it give us as a church? Why do we have it in the canon? It serves as a memorial, lest we forget. It serves as a voice so that we can hear the poetry of suffering. It serves as a confession to remind us of the importance of going to God, confessing our sin, national, personal, the fall, all of that, and to recognize our contribution to human suffering and our own suffering, the suffering of others. A protest to be able to look at the world and say, why is it this way, Lord? And is this proportional? That we can speak to God in times of suffering and ask, how long, O Lord? Why, O Lord? And then finally, a home and a bottle. Here, this book provides us a place for the sufferer, a safe space, and here we find the collection of tears, that God cares. It's a reminder. God preserved this book in the canon. He wanted us to read it. He wanted us to understand this. And so in that itself is a respecting of the suffering and tears of the people of God. And so it comes home to us. That's why the book of Lamentations. Thanks for coming to the Bistro today. Thanks for sampling off the menu. One more of these in the series on Lamentations, Jesus Christ in the book of Lamentations. I hope you will engage in that next week. God bless you and have a great day.